Hello to all of you. Let's discuss chapter number 6. And chapter number 6 is about cellular respiration. So, first of all, let me explain you what this process of cellular respiration is. So, if you look at this picture, so if I would have been teaching this topic in the classroom, I would have shown this picture to the students and I would have asked them, like, what do you see in this picture? So basically in this picture you can see that this is a car, this is the gas station where the gas is filled in the car, and this is like your sugar, this is your cell, this is oxygen, this is carbon dioxide and water. So basically what is this, what analogy is being shown in this picture? So basically, as you know that when we drive the car, we need to fuel the car with the gas, right? We fill our car with the gas, and a process of combustion takes place, and as a result of that our car moves, a lot of energy is produced, and that helps in the movement of the car. So similarly, for the movement of our car, the fuel is required. Similarly, for us, we also need the fuel, right? For our life we also need the fuel, we need the energy. So how does the energy, how do we get the energy? So we eat food, right? So here this is a bag of sugar which is shown, which is a source of energy, or it's a fuel for our cells. So basically the way our for the movement of our car, fuel is required and we fill the gas, and by the process of combustion energy is released, and that makes our car move, and in this process carbon dioxide and water are produced, and these are the waste products of this process, right? So similarly in our cells, so we are nothing but cells, right? So we are organisms, we are the basic unit of the life is cell, and we are nothing but made of trillions of cells. We are nothing but made of trillions of cells. So at every cell's level or at a cellular level, energy is released from the food we eat. Okay, so our food involves many things like sugars, proteins, lipids. That's what we eat in our food. So here only sugar is shown. So the food we eat, energy is released from that food. We know that energy is in the food, but energy has to be extracted from the food, and that energy is extracted from the food by a process of cellular respiration. In the process of cellular respiration, the food we have eaten, the energy we have eaten, from that food energy is released by the process of cellular respiration, and that process also needs oxygen. Okay, just the same way, in the car we fill the gas and combustion takes place. For that process oxygen is required. Similarly, in the process of cellular respiration is a process in which energy is released from the food. It involves oxygen, and I'm going to talk very shortly why in this process oxygen is required or what is its function. And in this process energy is released which is used by our cells, and also carbon dioxide and water, they are formed, and they are the waste products or byproducts of the process of cellular respiration. Okay, so this is basically talked in this slide. It's everything the same which I just talked about. So life is work. Living cells require energy from outside sources to do work. As I said, here it's shown this is a cell and energy is required, and in this process carbon dioxide and water are released, and this process needs oxygen. So if we talk about the work at the cellular level, so basically at every cell's level there is a lot of work going on which involves the membrane transport, which means things are moving in, things are moving out through the transport. Then a lot of anabolic reactions are taking place inside the cells, like amino acids, they are linked together and they're forming proteins. Movement is taking place. So all these activities, they need energy. And animals can obtain energy to do this work by feeding on other animals or photosynthetic organisms. So basically our food is either we eat plants or we eat meat. So we basically eat food and the energy is released from the food we have eaten. Okay, something very important to understand here is the relationship between the process of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. I have already posted one activity which is an activity involving the relationship or the conceptual relationship, or how these two processes of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, how they are linked. So that's an activity you can do, and the digital concept mapping this week is also basically involves the correlation of these two processes of photosynthesis and the cellular respiration. So please do that activity, do that worksheet before you do the digital concept mapping. So basically, so the basic source of life, the basic source of life, the basic source of energy on our planet is basically from the sun. So we are getting the main source of energy is sun, and that energy is taken by photosynthetic, that light energy is taken by the photosynthetic organisms, and they do the process of photosynthesis, which we have learned in chapter number 5, that how the energy is taken by sun, by the photons of sun, and there's a splitting of water molecules which releases oxygen, and also there's a pigment in these plants called plants and the other photosynthetic organisms called chlorophyll, and the sun's light is entrapped by the pigment called chlorophyll, and as a result of that the other chemical forms of energy are produced called ATP and NADPH, and then eventually that takes place in the light reactions, and in the second phase basically carbon dioxide fixation takes place, and as a result of that with the help of the two products of the light reactions, which is ATP and NADPH, the carbon dioxide is fixed, and there is formation of organic molecules like glucose, and also oxygen is produced in the light reactions. So basically, in the process of photosynthesis which takes place in the chloroplast, these plants or the photosynthetic organisms, they take carbon dioxide and water, and they produce organic molecules and oxygen. And these organic molecules, which includes the food, the glucose, these organic molecules, these are the two products of photosynthesis. These are two products of photosynthesis, formation of organic molecule, which is glucose plus oxygen. So these organic molecules are eaten by the animals, right, like by us, and with the process of cellular respiration, which takes place in the mitochondria, which is the organelle, which we are going to talk about today. So in the mitochondria, the energy is released. Okay, so the animals like us, we take organic molecules which are formed by plants by the process of photosynthesis, and oxygen is also given to us by plants by the process of photosynthesis, and by the process of cellular respiration, from the organic molecules and also taking help of oxygen, energy is produced, and that energy is produced in the form of ATP, and ATP basically drives many functions. And in this process of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide and water are formed. So by the process of cellular respiration which takes place in mitochondria, ATP is produced and carbon dioxide and water are produced. And carbon dioxide and water, they are the byproducts of the process of cellular respiration. And these byproducts of the cellular respiration, which is carbon dioxide and water, they are taken by carbon dioxide and water. They are taken by photosynthetic organisms, and by the process of photosynthesis, they convert them into organic molecules and oxygen. So this is the way how these processes of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, they are related. So photosynthetic organisms, they take carbon dioxide and water, and carbon dioxide and water, they are the byproducts. They are the byproducts of the cellular respiration. They are taken by photosynthetic organisms, and by making use of light energy, which is coming from sun, they convert it into organic molecules and oxygen. And these organic molecules and oxygen, they are taken by animals, and by the process of cellular respiration, energy is released from organic molecules, and carbon dioxide and water, they are formed as the byproducts. So this is the way these two processes, they are related. So we studied chapter photosynthesis in chapter number 5, and we are going to talk about cellular respiration process in chapter number 6. So but this is the way how these processes are related. So please do that worksheet and then do the digital concept mapping. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the process of cellular respiration, and this process of cellular respiration, it involves 3 stages. The first stage is called glycolysis, second is called citric acid cycle, and third is called oxidative phosphorylation. Now the first step is glycolysis. Glyco word means sugar, lysis means breaking. So the process of glycolysis means the breakdown of sugar. So in the process, in the first stage of glycolysis, the one molecule is converted into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay, so pyruvate is a kind of a compound which has 3 carbons. Glucose has 6 carbons. So glucose has 6 carbons and pyruvate has 3 carbons. So glycolysis involves breaking down of glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate, and then this pyruvate further gets converted into acetyl coenzyme A, and then acetyl coenzyme A enters into the second stage, which is called citric acid cycle. And in this citric acid cycle, there's a complete breakdown of glucose, and then the last step is called oxidative phosphorylation. So this is a quite complicated process, but with you guys I'm going to talk in a very simple form, and I'm basically going to give you the outline. The overall thing which you need to understand from this process is cellular respiration is a process by which energy is released from the food we have eaten. The energy is there in the food, and that energy is released by this process of cellular respiration, and this process of cellular respiration also involves oxygen. So the oxygen we are breathing in, so the oxygen we are breathing in is helping us in the process of cellular respiration, because this oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor in this process. So I will tell you what does that basically mean. So important thing to understand here is there are 2 important things. Number 1, energy is released from the food we have eaten. Number 2, oxygen is involved in this process, and this oxygen we are breathing in and we are taking out carbon dioxide. So in this chapter you will understand why we breathe in oxygen and why do we take out carbon dioxide. So what is happening at a cellular level. So so you must have like if somebody asks what is breathing or what is respiration, we say we take in oxygen, we take out carbon dioxide, right? We take in oxygen and we take out carbon dioxide. This is what the process of cellular respiration is, or this is what the breathing is, right? So but what is the purpose of taking in oxygen, and how does carbon dioxide is coming out? So the purpose of taking in oxygen is it acts as the final electron acceptor. So the energy in the food is in the form of high energy electrons, because if you remember, our food is made of proteins, lipids and carbohydrates, and these are macromolecules, these are big molecules, these are polymers, and these polymers, they are made of monomers, and these monomers, they're connected to each other, or they're linked to each other by the covalent bonds. And these covalent bonds, if you remember from chapter number 2, covalent bonds are formed by the sharing of electrons. So basically the energy in the food is in the form of high energy electrons, and you will see that in this process of cellular respiration at every step the energy will be stripped in the form of electrons, and the energy and so these electrons, we will also talk about some electron carriers. These electron carriers, the function of electron carriers is to carry these electrons to the final stage, which is the inner membrane of mitochondria. We'll talk about all these things. And at the final, at the end of the, so in the inner membrane of mitochondria, there is an electron transport chain, and this electron transport chain is nothing but some protein complexes which are embedded in the inner membrane of mitochondria. So we have already talked about the structure of mitochondria. At the end of the electron transport chain, there is oxygen, and this oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor. So energy in the food is in the form of electrons, and these electrons, they are stripped at different stages, and these electrons, they are accepted finally by oxygen, because oxygen is the final electron acceptor, and it is very electronegative, which means it has a tendency to pull the electrons towards itself. So that is the reason why we are breathing in oxygen, because oxygen, it is very electronegative and it has a tendency to pull the electrons towards itself. So I'm going to quickly talk to you about the different stages of the cellular respiration, and before that, let me just review the structure of the cell. So this is the structure of the cell, and this is the cytoplasm, and this is the mitochondria. So this is the outer membrane of mitochondria, this is the inner membrane of mitochondria. We have already talked about the inner membrane of mitochondria is all invaginated, and these invaginations are all because they are all to increase the surface area. So the inner membrane is invaginated to increase the surface area. In this inner membrane of mitochondria, in this inner membrane of mitochondria are embedded some protein complexes. And the electrons which will be stripped at different stages of the cellular respiration, they reach to the electron transport chain, which is embedded in the inner membrane of mitochondria, and at the end of the electron transport chain is oxygen, which is very electronegative, and it has a tendency to pull the electrons towards itself. So in this whole process, you will see the energy is produced in the form of ATP, because ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the energy currency in our cells. So that is the form of energy which our cells can use. So let me show you. So this is the cytoplasm. The first step is glycolysis. And we will be talking about the process cellular respiration by taking the example of one molecule of glucose. So remember that in our food, we don't only eat glucose, we also eat proteins, we also eat fats. So, but when we talk, to make it simple, we just take the example of glucose, and then we talk about how the energy is extracted at different stages. First step is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is the breakdown of sugar. This first phase takes place in cytoplasm, and in this step, glucose is converted into pyruvate. So glucose has 6 carbons and pyruvate has 3 carbons. So by the process of glycolysis, ATP is produced, and the ATP, so we will be also talking about, there are 2 ways by which the energy is released from the food we have eaten. One process is called substrate level phosphorylation, and the second process is called oxidative phosphorylation. So substrate level phosphorylation and oxidative phosphorylation. So we'll talk about these, these are 2 different processes by which ATP is produced. So by the process of glycolysis, glucose is converted into pyruvate, and this takes place in cytosol, and only here 2 molecules of ATP are produced. And then also important thing to talk about the structure of mitochondria is this part of the mitochondria. This is called mitochondrial matrix. Okay, so by the process of glycolysis, glucose is converted into pyruvate, and then this pyruvate is converted into acetyl coenzyme A. This is called conversion step, and the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A takes place in the mitochondrial matrix. It takes place in the mitochondrial matrix, and in this step, no energy is produced, but in this step, first molecule of carbon dioxide is released. And then this acetyl coenzyme A enters into citric acid cycle, and then again ATP is produced by the process of substrate level phosphorylation. And at every step, glycolysis, conversion, and citric acid cycle, the energy is from the different compounds or different intermediate metabolites. The electrons, they are stripped. And these electrons, they are carried by the electron carriers, and these electron carriers, they get reduced, and these electron carriers, they eventually take these electrons to the inner membrane of mitochondria, and these electrons are eventually taken by oxygen. And in this whole process, the last step, when the electrons reach the inner membrane of mitochondria with the help of the different electron carriers, when they reach there, they flow through electron transport chains. And what is electron transport chain? It is there are four protein complexes which are embedded in the inner membrane of mitochondria. So the electrons, they flow through these protein complexes which make the electron transport chain, and then eventually the energy is produced. Then there is involvement of another enzyme called ATP synthase, and lot of energy is produced at this step by the process of oxidative phosphorylation. So oxidative phosphorylation involves electron transport chain and a process of chemiosmosis. So I'm going to keep very simple with you guys. So the overall thing is, at different stages ATP is produced. So there is no ATP produced at this step, but here first molecule of carbon dioxide is released. This basically shows you the electron carriers. As I said, I've shown here that the electrons are stripped from the food, and those electrons are taken by the electron carriers, and there are two electron carriers involved in the process of cellular respiration. One is NAD plus, another is FAD. NAD plus and FAD, and these electron carriers, they carry the electrons and they get reduced. So this is basically a cartoon which shows you that how electron carriers, they carry the electrons and they make them reach the destination. So these electron carriers, here is one example of NAD plus. So NAD plus is just being shown you as a cab here. So, and the electron carriers are being compared to the electron carriers, they are being compared to the cabs, because what is the function of a cab? The function of the cab is to take the passengers, right? So this is the cab, this is the empty cab, these are the passengers. So once they sit inside, the cab is loaded, and then they make their passengers reach their destination. They make the passengers reach their destination, and the cab becomes empty again. Okay, so that is what the function of the electron carriers is. So when the electron carriers, they are empty, so this is NAD plus, which is an electron carrier. This is NAD plus, which is an electron carrier. So you can see here right now it is empty. It is not carrying the electron. So here the cab is being shown as electron carrier, which is NAD plus. Passengers are being shown as electrons. So you can see here electrons are not being carried by the electron carrier. So it's an analogy which is being shown that this cab is empty, and when the cab is carrying the electrons, or when NAD plus, which is electron carrier, NAD plus, which is the electron carrier, when it is when it has taken the electrons, it becomes reduced. Okay, so NAD plus gets converted into NADH. So NAD plus gets reduced and it forms NAD plus, and the cab becomes occupied. And once the cab releases, when the cab basically delivers its, basically drops off its passengers, the cab becomes empty again. The cab becomes empty again, and it gets converted into NAD plus, which is basically your electron carrier. So when NADH releases its electrons to the inner NADH, when it releases its electrons to the inner membrane of mitochondria, it becomes oxidized again. I hope you understand what is oxidation and reduction. Oxidation is the loss of electrons, and reduction is the gain of electrons. So here you can see NAD plus is accepting electrons. Okay, so you can see one electron coming from here, one electron coming from here. So when it accepts the electrons, it gets reduced and it becomes NADH. And when it releases its electrons, it becomes oxidized again. So when it is accepting electrons, it becomes reduced and it forms NADH. When it releases its electrons, it becomes oxidized again and it becomes NAD plus. So the food we eat, the energy is in the form of electrons, as I said. And electrons are subatomic particles. We have studied in chapter number 2. So electrons do not run alone like that. So they are in the form of atoms because they're subatomic particles. So the electrons, they are present in the form of hydrogen atoms. Okay, so that is why they're shown here. So here they are what is being represented here is two hydrogen atoms which are coming from the food. So every hydrogen atom has one electron and one proton. So this is one electron, this is one proton. Electron, proton, one electron, one proton. So NAD plus has a charge. So if you remember from chapter number 2, any atom, when it has positive charge, when it has a positive charge, it means that it has one less electron. So these are the two hydrogen atoms which are coming from the food. So these are two hydrogen atoms which are coming from the food. So first of all, one hydrogen atom is going to give its one electron, and this NAD plus is going to get converted into NAD, and then it is going to accept second hydrogen which has one electron and one proton, and it is going to be converted into NADH. So basically in this whole process, when NAD plus gets converted into NADH, it accepts two electrons and one proton is free. So NAD plus gets converted into NADH and one proton will be free. So this is the way how these electron carriers they work. So in this whole process of cellular respiration, the process of oxidative phosphorylation produces 90% of the ATP, and substrate level phosphor by a very small proportion of energy is produced by the process of substrate level phosphorylation. So from one molecule of glucose, around 32 molecules of ATP are produced, and that's what we are going to talk about in this process. And we will be also talking about so in this whole process, from one molecule of glucose, 32 molecules of ATP are produced. So you need to know that. So this is basically the whole process of cellular respiration. I'm not going to go into the details. So basically what you need to know, that the first stage is glycolysis, second is called citric acid cycle, and third is called oxidative phosphorylation. And so this is what you basically need to know. First stage is glycolysis, in which glucose is converted into pyruvate and produces two molecules of ATP, and these molecules of ATP, they are produced by the process of substrate level phosphorylation. And then this pyruvate is converted into acetyl coenzyme A. Pyruvate has three carbons, acetyl coenzyme has 2 carbons, and here first molecule of carbon dioxide is released. Okay, and this acetyl coenzyme A, which has 2 carbons, it enters into the citric acid cycle, and in this citric acid cycle, again ATP is produced by the process of substrate level phosphorylation, and in this citric acid cycle, the glucose is all the whole energy is extracted from the food in this citric acid cycle. And then also very important thing which is happening in every step is, as I said, here ATP is produced by substrate level phosphorylation. In citric acid cycle also ATP is produced by substrate level phosphorylation. Very important thing to remember here is, at every step the electrons are being stripped. The electrons are being stripped from the food we have eaten in different stages. When glucose is getting converted into pyruvate, electrons are being stripped and they are being taken by the electron carriers NAD plus, and NAD plus gets converted into NADH. Then this pyruvate is converted into acetyl coenzyme A. Here again NAD plus is involved and it gets converted into NADH. And then this acetyl coenzyme A is enters into citric acid cycle, and in this citric acid cycle also there are 2 kinds of electron carriers involved, NAD plus and FAD. And NAD plus and FAD, they are reduced, because when they carry the electrons, which means when they take the electrons, they get reduced and they get converted into NADH and FADH2. Okay, they get converted into NADH and FADH2, and then these electrons which are being stripped at every stage, and they are taken by the electron carriers. These electrons, they eventually reach the inner membrane of they eventually reach the inner membrane of mitochondria by these electron carriers, and they go through these protein complexes. Which forms the electron transport chain, and this electron transport chain is nothing but some protein complexes, and these electrons, they move through these they move through these proteins, and they release the energy. Because these electrons are high energy electrons, they release the energy, and that energy is actually used to create a proton pump, because there are a lot of protons here. I don't want to go into the details of all these things, what happens. They create a kind of electron gradient, and then these protons, they flow back through another protein called ATP synthase, and the flowing of protons through ATP synthase, that process called chemiosmosis, and in this whole process, a lot of molecules of ATP are produced. So basically, you need to remember that in the last step, which is called oxidative phosphorylation, a lot of molecules of ATP are produced, and 90% of ATP is produced at this step. And oxidative phosphorylation involves two processes. One is electron transport and chemiosmosis. So we have talked about all these things. And another thing which I would like to talk to you about is fermentation. So we also need to know about fermentation. So fermentation is basically fermentation is a process which is it's an anaerobic process, which means it does not involve oxygen. Cellular respiration, which I just discussed, it's a aerobic process because it involves oxygen. Fermentation is a short way of producing energy, and it takes place in the absence of oxygen. And fermentation is basically glycolysis. So cellular respiration involves 3 stages, and the first stage is glycolysis. So fermentation basically involves glycolysis. So cellular respiration depends on electronegative oxygen to pull the electrons down the transport chain. Glycolysis couples with fermentation to produce ATP. So basically, fermentation is basically glycolysis, and it involves one extra step. And because fermentation only involves glycolysis, it uses the process of substrate level phosphorylation. So fermentation consists of glycolysis plus reactions that regenerate NAD plus, which can be used by glycolysis. I'm going to talk to you about that. There are 2 kinds of fermentations. One is called alcoholic fermentation, and this is called lactic acid fermentation. So let me explain you from here. So basically, as I said, fermentation is glycolysis. Okay, it involves glycolysis and plus one extra step. So let's first of all talk about alcoholic fermentation. So in the alcoholic fermentation, glucose, by the process of glycolysis, is converted into 2 molecules of pyruvate, and then this pyruvate is converted into acetaldehyde. So pyruvate has 3 carbons, you can see. Acetaldehyde has 2 carbons. So where does the third carbon goes? Third carbon is released here as carbon dioxide, and then this acetaldehyde is converted into ethanol. So let's see what is happening here. So glucose getting converted into pyruvate, this is glycolysis, and in the glycolysis, 2 molecules of ATP are produced, and also 2 molecules of NAD plus, which is the electron carrier. It gets reduced to NADH. It gets reduced. Okay. Now it's very important for these electron carriers, once they get reduced, to get oxidized, because just like the cab people, they carry their passengers, and they make them reach the destination, right? So the function of cabs, the cab people, is to take the passengers and make them reach the destination, to drop them off, right? So it is very important for the cabs to drop their passengers, because if they do not drop their passengers, what's going to happen? They cannot bring more passengers, correct? So similarly, it's very important for these electron carriers. It's very important for these electron carriers, once they get reduced, for them to get oxidized again. So NAD plus during the process of glycolysis gets converted into NADH, which means it gets reduced, and this NADH, it needs to get oxidized again. So it needs to get oxidized again. So how does that oxidation takes place? Because if it doesn't get oxidized, which means if NAD plus is not regenerated, this whole process of glycolysis will stop. So this NAD plus gets converted into NADH, and now let's see how does this gets gets oxidized again. So glucose gets converted into pyruvate. Here 2 molecules of carbon dioxide released. Pyruvate gets converted into acetaldehyde. Now this acetaldehyde, okay, it accepts the electrons. Okay, it accepts the electrons, and you can see that this acetaldehyde, and remember that these electrons they do not run as subatomic particles. They are in the form of hydrogen atoms. So you can see here this acetaldehyde, it is accepting electrons in the form of hydrogen atoms. One hydrogen is coming here, another hydrogen is coming here, and this acetaldehyde gets converted into ethanol. So in this case of fermentation, acetaldehyde, in the case of alcoholic fermentation, it acts as the final electron acceptor. It acts as the electron acceptor, and it gets oxidized, it gets reduced, it itself gets reduced and forms ethanol. Unlike aerobic respiration, unlike cellular respiration, where oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor. So basically, alcoholic fermentation, let me give you one example of alcoholic fermentation. If you have tried making bread at home, so what do we do? So basically we take some yeast, right? We take yeast, we activate the yeast, and we take all-purpose flour. We add the all-purpose flour to the flour. We add these we add the activated yeast to the all-purpose flour, right? We make a dough and we keep it in the dark place, and after some time you must have seen that dough rises. So why does that dough rises? That is happening because of the production of carbon dioxide. So what is happening in this process when we are making the dough for bread? We are actually undergoing, what process is happening in that process is alcoholic fermentation is taking place. So the energy or the glucose which is there in the all-purpose flour, it is getting fermented. And first of all, it is going through the process of glycolysis. In that process of glycolysis, glucose is getting converted to pyruvate, and then that pyruvate gets converted into acetaldehyde. And in this process, carbon dioxide is released, and this carbon dioxide is making the dough rise. And then eventually, the electrons will be taken by the electrons which are being carried by the electron carrier NAD+. They will be taken by the electrons which are in the form of reduced form of NADH. These electrons will be taken by acetaldehyde, and it will be converted into ethanol. So what about when we make the bread? So does that mean that there is a ethanol in the bread when we make? Yes, in this process, because when we do the fermentation of the dough for the bread, we do the fermentation only for very, very short time. It is only for a few hours. So in this process, traces of ethanol are produced, but it's not a lot. And when we bake the bread, these traces of ethanol, they get evaporated. So alcoholic fermentation is a process which takes place when these wineries, they make wines and all that. So in this process, a lot of ethanol is produced. Because that fermentation process takes for very long time. Unlike when we are making the bread, this fermentation process takes place for very short time. Now the second kind of fermentation is lactic acid fermentation. This lactic acid fermentation, it actually takes place in our muscle cells also, and in our muscles basically lactic acid is produced. It is basically this. Why do our cells undergo the process of lactic acid fermentation? So when we are doing a vigorous exercise, at that point what happens is our cells need a lot of energy in very short time. So our cells cannot go through the process of aerobic respiration or cellular respiration because it involves many stages. So in that situation, our cells bypass the process of cellular respiration and they go through fermentation, because fermentation involves only one step, which is the glycolysis, and it produces ATP, although the amount of ATP which is produced is very less, but it is a quicker way. And in this process of the lactic acid fermentation which takes place in our muscle cells, when we are doing vigorous exercise, our cells do not undergo through the process of aerobic respiration. They undergo the process of fermentation, which is shorter process, involves only one step, which is glycolysis, but produces only 2 molecules of ATP. So in this process, lactate is produced, and you must have seen sometimes when we do vigorous exercise, our muscles starts paining. Why do our muscles start paining? Because of the production of lactate. This accumulation of lactate gives pain to our muscles. So let's go over and talk about the actual process, what happens inside of our muscle cells. Glucose gets converted into pyruvate by the process glycolysis, and then this pyruvate acts as the electron acceptor because NAD plus is reduced to NADH. So NADH is a reduced form of NAD plus. It is carrying electrons, and these electrons, they are eventually accepted by pyruvate, and this pyruvate gets converted into lactate. So in both processes, whether it's the alcoholic fermentation or lactic acid fermentation, in both processes ATP is produced by glycolysis, which is only 2 molecules of ATP, which is like very less energy as compared to the process of cellular respiration, which 32 molecules of ATP are produced. And in both these processes, NAD plus is regenerated, because if NAD plus is not regenerated, the process of glycolysis will stop, because NAD plus is an electron carrier. Energy is in the form of high energy electrons, and these electrons needs to be carried by these electron carriers, and when they carry these electrons, they get reduced, so eventually they need to be reoxidized again. Lactic acid fermentation, as I said, it takes place in our muscle cells, and also lactic acid fermentation is also used by some fungus and bacteria to make some yeast and the yogurt. Comparing fermentation and aerobic respiration, both use glycolysis, and the net outcome of glycolysis is 2 molecules of ATP, and they both use NAD plus as the electron carrier, which is the oxidizing agent that accepts electrons during glycolysis. So the processes have different mechanisms for oxidizing NADH to NAD plus. Yes, this is very, very important. These are the differences between cellular respiration and fermentation. In fermentation, either pyruvate or acetaldehyde, it acts as the final electron acceptor. It takes these electrons and regenerates NAD plus. But in the cellular respiration, it is the oxygen. It is the oxygen which takes these electrons, and oxygen acts as the final electron acceptor. In cellular respiration, the yield of ATP is 32 molecules. In fermentation, only 2 molecules of ATP. Okay, the last important thing which we need to know how to relate this chapter to cancer is there are some enzymes which are so basically cellular respiration is a is a process which is a metabolic process. So how we can relate this chapter to cancer? There are some enzymes which are metabolism related enzymes like hexokinase, phosphofructokinase, pyruvate kinase. So these enzymes, hexokinase, phosphofructokinase, and pyruvate kinase, these are the enzymes which are actually involved in the first stage of cellular respiration, which is called glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis is a very important step, and this is a step which is involved in aerobic respiration as well as fermentation. And these are some of the enzymes: hexokinase, phosphofructokinase, and pyruvate kinase. These are some of the enzymes which are involved in glycolysis, and they get overexpressed in cancer. And because of the overexpression of these enzymes, these metabolism related enzymes, these cells start dividing aberrantly and they become abnormal cells. And because of the abnormal division of the cells, these cells don't divide in an organized way, just the way the normal cells divide. They form a mass of cells, and the mass of cells is called a tumor. And when the tumor is confined to a region, that cancer at that stage is called benign, because it is confined to one place. So when the cancer is benign, it can be treated, because it can be removed by surgery, or it can be even taken care by radiotherapy. But once the cancer when the cancer spreads out, and technically we call this term metastasis. When the cancer cells, first of all, the cancer cells, they invade the neighboring regions, okay, and after that they start moving to distant organs through blood and lymph, and this process is called metastasis. So they start moving to distant organs, and then at that stage the cancer becomes malignant, because once the cancer has spread out, it's very difficult to control. So the cause of cancer, there are many causes of cancer. It's a multifactorial disease. But with this chapter, we can relate that there is the overexpression of some of the enzymes which are involved in metabolism, and these three enzymes are involved in glycolysis. These enzymes, they get overexpressed and they make the cells grow in an abnormal way. So that's all from this chapter. And if you need any help or if you have any question, please let me know.